Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Have you noticed how some people are only valued after they die, or after they scream? The truth is harsh. We live in a time that idolizes youth and discards experience like recyclable trash. But what if I told you that the greatest lesson of your life might be hidden behind wrinkles and gray hair? This story will flip a switch in your mind, especially if you've ever laughed at someone for not keeping up. Forget everything you think you know about success, respect, and recognition, because what you're about to witness isn't just about golf, it's about silent judgments, shocking turnarounds that expose ignorance, and a man who silenced an entire club with a single swing. Yes, just one. But hold on, don't skip to the end, because what transforms us isn't the finale, it's the journey. Every detail in this story holds up a mirror. And the question you need to ask yourself is, have I ever dismissed someone who actually deserved applause? Samuel arrived early before the sun had fully risen. His worn-out hat carried more stories than many fancy resumes. And yet, when he asked to use the golf course, he was met with stifled giggles and mocking stares. "Sir, the bingo room is over there," one of the young men joked. It's funny how youth sometimes feels entitled to mock what it hasn't yet lived. The club attendant tried to hide it, but the poison had already been poured. "This area's for fit players, sir," he said, pointing toward the course as if guarding sacred ground. No one bothered to ask who the man was. No one cared to hear his stories. After all, the urge to judge is always stronger than the willingness to listen. And so, without argument, Samuel just nodded and walked away. Now stop and think. How many times have you done the same to someone? At work, in line at the bank, even inside your own home. How many stories have you ignored just because the wrapping looked too old to be relevant? Samuel wasn't offended. He had seen this before. But what came next? No one saw coming. What those young men didn't know was that Samuel wasn't just a slow-walking old man. He was a living legend. Back in the 70s and 80s, his name was on the covers of sports magazines, and his swings were taught in elite training programs. His were stories of sweat, discipline, and brilliance that shaped generations. In fact, some of the current idols from that very same club had been coached by him. But the world, my friend, has a short memory when vanity is the lens. While many see old age as a limitation, Samuel was the embodiment of what truly matters: legacy. He didn't need a grand introduction, nor did he demand respect. He had lived more than any trophy could ever prove. The problem was, the others didn't know that yet. And as it happens in so many stories, sometimes the greatest treasure is right in front of us, but arrogance blinds us to it. You know what this reminds me of? That old tale about the multi-million-dollar violin being played by a master in a subway, and no one stopped to listen. The same happened here. Talent, experience, and value were present, but invisible to eyes clouded by prejudice. Samuel had nothing left to prove, but fate, that great writer of stories, decided it was time for a plot twist. Samuel left in silence. No slammed doors, no raised voice, not even a look of defiance. His steps echoed calmly through the club's lobby, like someone who's walked away like this before. It wasn't the first time doors had been closed to him, doors that were never truly open. And it likely wouldn't be the last. Because when your face carries the marks of time, the world insists on confusing experience with obsolescence. But Samuel knew the difference. He knew he wasn't carrying a burden. He was carrying wisdom. And that sometimes, silence speaks louder than any fiery speech. The contempt he received that afternoon hurt, of course, because no one ever really gets used to injustice, even when it knocks often. The smirks, the whispered remarks, the glances that scan you from head to toe and decide you're not good enough. It was all too familiar. Samuel had felt it in other places, with different clothes, accents, and faces, but always the same judgment. And yet he remained whole, because he knew some stories aren't told with words. They're told with posture, with dignity, with the calm of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. And his posture said it all. I know who I am, and that's enough. But the universe has its spies, people who observe in silence, who see beyond appearances. And in that club, among many distracted faces, there was one paying attention. Brian, a young employee still early in his career, wasn't one to follow the herd. He didn't laugh along. He didn't pretend not to notice. He watched, and it was this quiet attention that made him realize something was different about that old man, something that stirred him. not because of the simple clothes or old age, but because of the dignity with which he walked away. Samuel didn't look defeated. He looked complete. And that, for Brian, sparked a question. In that question, a spark was born. And, as in so many turning point stories, that flicker of discomfort triggered a transformation. Because when empathy meets curiosity, the chance for something new arises. And Brian, unlike his colleagues who followed the protocol of prejudice, decided to explore that feeling. He didn't want to fall asleep that night carrying the silent guilt of having ignored someone valuable. So, at the end of his shift, he did something rare these days. He listened. Without fanfare, he looked for Samuel, found him sitting on a park bench near the club, watching the sunset like someone who knows beauty lives in details the rushed never notice. He sat beside him, respectfully, unhurried, and there, in that comfortable silence, a conversation began that would change his life. He asked gently, without invading, and when Samuel began to speak, what came out wasn't bitterness. It was history, the kind told in a calm voice, but filled with inner earthquakes. Brian was stunned. He discovered that this humble man had once coached athletes who now grace magazine covers, that he had won international tournaments back when championships were built on sweat, not marketing, that Samuel had started a social project bringing golf to communities that barely had grass, let alone clubs, and more. He told all of this without arrogance, without self-promotion, as if it were simply part of the journey, not a medal on his chest. "But why didn't you say anything?" Brian asked, genuinely confused. Samuel smiled like someone who's heard that question many times, and replied with the calm of someone who's seen life from behind the curtain. "If you need to prove who you are, you haven't yet understood your own worth." That phrase echoed in Brian's mind, because it was more than an answer. It was a key, a mirror, an invitation to reflect. How many times had he tried to prove something? How often did he feel small without recognition? And there, in front of that man who had outlived time itself, he understood that worth doesn't lie in applause. It lies in a clear conscience, in sleeping peacefully, even when the world doesn't recognize what you've done. The next day, Brian couldn't just go through his routine. Something had changed. That conversation had planted a seed in his heart, and when well watered, seeds become revolutions. When he arrived at the club, instead of hiding behind protocol, he went straight to the manager. He made a simple but bold request, that Samuel be given another chance to step onto the course. Not as a visitor, but as a participant. He didn't say who he was, just said, "Trust me." The manager hesitated, but agreed. Brian then signed Samuel up for the club's internal charity tournament, the one that brought together young talents, all full of themselves, with brand new gear and selfie-ready smiles. That day, unknowingly, those young men were about to live one of the most impactful stories of their lives. The same man they had mocked was now standing beside them on the green, and Samuel entered with his usual calm. No theatrics, no announcement, because true masters don't arrive making noise. They arrive leaving footprints. The match began, and it only took a few plays for silence to fall. Samuel didn't need to shout or show off. Every swing was a lesson, every move, a reminder that experience is something time cannot erase. He wasn't playing to win. He was playing to teach. And each young man there, even without realizing it, was being transformed. Because those living stories, the ones you witness with your own eyes, hold a power no book or speech can match. In the end, it wasn't the points that stayed in people's memories. It was the posture. It was the humility with which Samuel guided the younger players, the gentle way he corrected them, how he laughed at their mistakes, but never at them, how he saw the field not as a battleground but as a place of learning. And when the applause began, still timid but sincere, Brian knew something had changed. The next day, without any fanfare, Brian did something unexpected. He signed Samuel up for the club's charity tournament. He didn't write his full name or mention his glorious past. He simply wrote, Samuel Andrade. And when one of the organizers asked if he was sure about entering an old man in a youth tournament, Brian calmly replied, "Trust me, because some stories don't need announcements, just opportunity." The same young players who had mocked Samuel the day before were now in the tournament. They arrived at the course full of swagger, laughing among themselves, ready for another day of personal glory. They had no idea that among them was someone with more time on the green than all of them combined had years of life. someone whose path had already become legend even if forgotten. Samuel stepped onto the course with slow but steady steps. No fanfare, no attempt to prove anything, just the serenity of someone who knows the terrain, the wind, the sound of silence between swings. With each step, it felt like he was measuring the energy of the place, like a conductor studying the acoustics before leading the orchestra. The game began, and the smug smiles quickly faded. Samuel's first shot was almost silent. Simple, subtle, but perfect. The ball glided through the air as if obeying invisible orders. It stopped inches from the hole. The once mocking expressions turned into looks of surprise. One boy, Felipe, scratched his head and said, "That was luck. But luck doesn't repeat." And Samuel did. Once, twice, 3 times, with the same unsettling precision. What was most curious was that he didn't celebrate. No raised arms, no triumphant gestures. He simply walked to the next shot with the same calm, almost instructional expression. It was as if he were teaching without a classroom, playing without competing. And little by little, the young players began to realize they weren't just in a tournament. They were living one of the greatest stories of their lives, even if they didn't know it yet. Felipe, the most arrogant of the group, began to change his tone. He watched Samuel's every move closely, tried to imitate his stance, his rhythm, but he quickly realized it wasn't just technique, it was presence, it was devotion, it was a kind of quiet wisdom that only time can teach those patient enough to listen. Throughout the game, Samuel started drawing closer to the boys. He gave tips, suggested angles, corrected postures with rare gentleness, and they, at first resistant, began to give in, as if something inside them said, "You have so much to learn from this man." Vanity gave way to curiosity. Competition turned into learning. Prejudice turned into admiration. Brian, watching from a distance, knew exactly what was happening. He recognized that silent pedagogy, that way of teaching without imposing. After all, he had been trained the same way years ago by Samuel himself. Seeing it all repeat now with a new generation was like witnessing a cycle being restored. One of those stories time insists on bringing back, right when humanity needs them most. Midway through the tournament, one of the boys, Tiago, who had barely spoken to Samuel before, approached and asked, "Did you used to play professionally?" Samuel smiled. "I've played all my life." Tiago didn't understand at first, but something about that answer hit differently. It wasn't about trophies. It was about purpose, about living with meaning. And that, more than any resume, left an impression. The sun began to dip, casting golden tones on the grass. The energy on the course had completely shifted. It was no longer a place of rivalry. It was an open-air classroom, and Samuel, unknowingly, had become the teacher for everyone there. Each step, each gesture, each simple phrase carried decades of practice, of mistakes, of victories, of stories, now intertwined with those of the boys. The scoreboard no longer mattered. For the first time, Felipe wasn't obsessed with winning. He was captivated by the process. "This man is different," he whispered to a teammate. "He plays with soul." And he wasn't wrong. Samuel seemed to communicate with the course. Each stroke had intention. Each silence had a lesson. Each look carried a memory that, even unspoken, was deeply felt. When the game ended, there was no usual celebration. Instead, there were spontaneous claps, not for the points, but for the experience. The boys approached Samuel with near ceremonial respect. They asked for advice, took pictures, asked questions, and they listened with the kind of attention they used to reserve only for celebrities, because now they knew they were in the presence of someone far greater than they imagined. Brian took the mic to close the afternoon, but before speaking, he looked at Samuel and asked, "Can I tell them who you are?" Samuel smiled. "Now you can." And so, in front of everyone, Brian revealed the truth. He spoke of the titles, the international tournaments, the golf clinics in underserved communities. He played old footage, newspaper headlines, black and white videos. The room went silent, the kind of silence that settles when truth weighs more than any word. "You didn't play against just anyone," Brian said. "You played with a living piece of our history." And suddenly, the boys realized that old man they had mocked was one of the greatest names in the sport. And more than that, he was someone who chose the path of teaching over revenge, who chose to touch hearts instead of feed resentment. Samuel never asked for applause, but he got it. He didn't demand respect. He earned it. Because some stories don't need fiery speeches. They only need someone willing to live them truthfully. And he did. In every shot, every suggestion, every gesture, he wrote another chapter of his legacy and allowed others to begin writing theirs. At the end of the ceremony, Felipe walked over with teary eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I think I learned more today than in years of training." Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder and replied, "The course teaches, but only if you're willing to listen." And in that moment, everyone understood. That field had hosted a tournament, yes, but more than that, it had been a stage for transformation, one of those stories that stays. At the end of the tournament, when the applause started, still soft, Brian took the mic. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you didn't play against just anyone. You played with a living piece of our history." Then the projection began. Old videos, yellowed photos, newspaper headlines. Samuel, the old man from yesterday, was actually the name behind many stories that shaped national golf. The room filled with murmurs and wide eyes. "Is that Samuel Andrade? Marcos Silveira's coach?" Some whispered. Others bowed their heads. The realization hit hard. Trophies were displayed. Testimonials from renowned athletes appeared on screen. It was like watching a museum come to life before their eyes. But what shocked them most wasn't the glorious past. It was the fact that none of them had recognized him before. And that, by itself, says a lot about how we treat certain stories. The local media, initially there just to cover a charity event, now had a brand new headline in their hands. Reporters asked for interviews. Photographers requested shots, and organizers scrambled to shift the focus of the event. But Samuel, true to his nature, simply smiled and said, "If this helps others see beyond appearances, it was worth it." And right there, amid the commotion, a new chapter of this story was beginning, one that would leave marks far beyond the green. That same evening, the videos began circulating on social media. Samuel became the most talked about name in the local sports world, not for scandal but for reappearing with dignity. Comments poured in from all sides. "How did we let this slip by? This man trained legends. Ashamed I laughed yesterday." And the truth is, few stories have the power to provoke immediate regret. This was one of them. Meanwhile, at the club, a quiet shift was taking place. Staff began talking among themselves about other forgotten figures, names that had once contributed and then vanished into the shadows. Samuel's case served as a wake-up call. It was time to revisit the archives, to listen to the elders, to recover memories that had been swept away by youth's rush. Because stories don't start out great. They grow in the details, over time, and through the persistence of those who refuse to let their legacy die. The next day, a handwritten letter was delivered to the club's board. It was from Samuel. He expressed gratitude for the recognition but made a request. "If you truly want to value the past, create a space for active listening. Let the veterans speak, not out of vanity, but so mistakes won't be repeated, so that the next generations know the roots before chasing the fruits." The proposal moved everyone. After all, there stood a man who could have demanded the world, but instead asked for awareness. The response was swift. 1 week later, the Voices of the Green project was launched, inviting one veteran each week to share their life stories with the younger players. The first guest, of course, was Samuel. He didn't bring slides or printed resumes. He brought his old golf club, his calloused hands, and a humility that silenced every doubt. He began by saying, "I didn't come to talk about glory. I came to talk about my mistakes, because those teach the most." The stories he told that day struck deep, from the time he lost a tournament for not respecting his body's limits, to the moment he almost quit because of hidden prejudice. Samuel spoke about failures, not accomplishments, and that's why it hit so hard. At the end, one of the boys, the same one who had mocked his age on the first day, approached him with teary eyes and asked for forgiveness. Samuel embraced him without a word. Because some stories don't need to be spoken, they are understood through gestures. Over time, the club began to transform. Panels were installed with brief biographies of forgotten athletes. The practice field was renamed after a black caddy who had been ignored for decades, and board meetings began reserving seats for senior advisors. It wasn't just about Samuel, it was about everyone who had been erased by the rush of modernity. It was about realizing that stories matter, even the ones that never made headlines. Newspapers, which once ignored the behind-the-scenes of the sport, began producing special features on the history of national golf. Samuel became a reference in documentaries, podcasts, and even educational projects. His once-forgotten name now graced rooms, trophies, and social programs, but he remained the same, quiet, observant, and more interested in shaping lives than basking in the spotlight. And perhaps that was the secret. He knew fame was fleeting, but impact was not. He knew applause meant nothing if not followed by real change. That's why, even when invited to TV shows, he preferred visiting public schools, teaching golf fundamentals with PVC pipes and worn-out tennis balls. He said, stories should be born right there, among those who still believed. At one of those school visits, a girl named Clara asked if she could be a golfer, even though she had no money for equipment. Samuel knelt down, looked into her eyes, and replied, "The club is just a tool. What matters is the strength in your gaze. And yours, my dear, has already won half the tournament." That phrase, which could have gone unnoticed, became the motto of a new project, Champion's Gaze, created for underprivileged girls. Once again, a story multiplied. Years later, when Samuel could no longer play, he was honored at an international event. He walked onto the stage with a cane, but with the same upright posture as always. And instead of speaking about victories, he said something that silenced the room. "Thank you for this tribute, but if I may, I'd like to dedicate it to those who never stood here, the invisible ones, the ones who carried our clubs, the ones who coached us in silence. It's their stories that brought me this far." The audience stood, not out of obligation, but because they understood that the real trophy isn't the one that shines on a shelf, but the one built in the hearts of others. Understood that some people weren't born to be monuments, they were born to be movements, and Samuel was one of them. After the reveal, the silence once filled with scorn turned into silence of shame. The sarcastic laughter from the previous day gave way to downcast eyes and trembling hands. Felipe, the most competitive of the group, slowly approached. "I'm sorry, sir, I think I've learned more today than in years of training." And he was right. Sometimes it's these disconcerting stories that break through arrogance and spark real transformation. Acknowledging your mistake isn't weakness, it's maturity. And that's what began to happen there. One by one, the young players approached Samuel, not as opponents, but as students. That golf course, once a stage for prejudice, now became a space of humility. And Samuel once again became a teacher without announcing himself as one. Because great stories don't need a spotlight. They are told through the eyes of those who've changed. And that's the heart of the matter. How many people have you judged before truly knowing them? How many masters have you ignored because you couldn't see beyond the surface? What happened at that club wasn't just a sports lesson. It was a lesson in humanity, one that often isn't taught at home or school. But when it comes, it shifts the very lens through which we see the world. And the club had no idea what was coming next. The following week, something unprecedented happened. The very youths who had mocked Samuel created a golf study group, not to improve their swing, but to understand the history of the sport, its values and its roots. They invited Samuel to share the stories he lived during his 76 years on the course. At first, he hesitated, not wanting to seem superior, but he accepted on one condition, that everyone there learned to play with ethics, listening as hard as they practiced their swing. At the first gathering, he pulled an old photo album from a worn-out bag. The images were faded, but full of meaning. Tournaments played on unwatered fields, handmade balls, clubs crafted from recycled wood. A time when skill wasn't measured by the cost of equipment, but by the persistence of the player. Each photo carried one of the stories that shaped his character, and now they were shaping those listening. It didn't take long for the club to realize something new was blooming. That generation, once obsessed with medals and status, now looked to the past with reverence. They started volunteering in social projects, hosting golf clinics in underprivileged neighborhoods. Samuel was always there, not as a star, but as a guide. And it was common to see young players repeating his words, his lessons, as if every story he shared planted a seed in their conscience. The board, which had initially ignored the discrimination, was forced to act. In a tense meeting, they proposed honoring Samuel with a plaque in the main hall, but he declined. Calmly he said, "A plaque doesn't teach. What transforms is action." Then he proposed something bolder, a mentorship program between veterans and newcomers. A space where stories wouldn't gather dust but live, teach, and breathe. The idea was approved, and it changed everything. Former players, once isolated, returned to the club with light in their eyes. Youngsters, once impatient, began to listen with care. Even the staff changed their attitudes. They no longer saw the elderly as burdens but as sources of wisdom. The club, once a setting of mockery and arrogance, now exhaled respect. All because someone chose to listen to a story instead of laugh at it. One afternoon, Felipe, the same boy who apologized, arrived at the course with his father, an 82-year-old man who had never held a club. He said he wanted to give back, wanted his father, who had spent a lifetime as a gardener, to feel what it meant to be respected in a place like that. Samuel walked with them, and as the elderly man missed shot after shot, no one laughed, no one scoffed. On the contrary, each attempt was celebrated as a victory, because some stories don't need skill, just presence. Social media began to capture this turning point. Short videos showed seniors and young people playing together. Samuel's phrases started appearing on t-shirts. One of them read, "Time doesn't rust talent, it only refines it." Another one went viral, "Listen before you judge. There's always a story trying to teach you something." And that's when the club moved from local headlines to national attention. Sports magazines came to cover the phenomenon. TV shows requested interviews. But Samuel remained grounded. "I don't want a stage. I want continuity." What moved him wasn't the spotlight. It was seeing a 9-year-old girl teach a 70-year-old man how to hold a golf club, and then hearing that man share a life lesson on patience that would change her forever. That's the cycle he believed in. Because stories survive in exchange, in listening, in connection. When the club finally decided to create a memorial honoring historic athletes, they included Samuel's name, but not as a trophy, as a starting point. Next to it, carved in marble, was a phrase, "Every story deserves to be heard before it's forgotten." And that phrase, more than decoration, became an unspoken rule of the place. From that moment on, no one entered the field without understanding that respect was the first move of the game. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was real. Some resisted, as always. They thought it was too much, that it was just drama. But most understood this wasn't just about golf. It was about seeing people, about not using age as a filter for value, because hidden in every wrinkle on a tired face might be the answer to a crisis you haven't even faced yet. And those stories have no substitute. The emotion was so overwhelming it couldn't be ignored. The club's board, once rigid in its traditions, felt the weight of collective shame and decided to act. In an extraordinary meeting, they approved a symbolic proposal. The annual Veterans Tournament would now bear Samuel's name, and more than that, a mentorship program for youth would be created, led by him. They finally understood that some stories must be honored while still alive. Not when it's too late, not in posthumous speeches, but with living, concrete gestures that shape the present and transform the future. The proposal wasn't just an act of reparation. It was a step toward reconnecting generations. Imagine promising youth being guided by someone who had faced every kind of field, even the harshest ones like prejudice. It's like putting a lighthouse in front of a ship before the storm, and that lighthouse had a name, a past, and accumulated wisdom. Because stories like this don't just inspire, they build character. And building character is rare in a world where speed tramples listening, and youth is often taught to dismiss what came before. Samuel, of course, was surprised. He never expected to be celebrated, much less on such a scale. He never sought a spotlight, just peace. But when he received the official invitation from the board, he did something no one expected. He didn't accept right away. He asked for time. Not to think about himself, but to reflect on what would truly make sense. Samuel didn't want a trophy with his name. He wanted change that went beyond the surface. And so, after 2 days in silence, he came back with a single condition. "I do want to help, but on one condition, that you offer full scholarships to children who have never had access to golf." Silence. Eyes met in the boardroom. No one had expected that. They were ready for a celebration, not a challenge. But after just a few seconds, the club president began to applaud, followed by everyone else. That demand said everything about Samuel. He didn't want a legacy mounted on a wall. He wanted a living legacy, one that multiplies into new stories, day after day on dusty grounds where dreams are born. The proposal was accepted, and soon, reality began to change. Children who had never seen a golf club up close began to walk on fields once reserved for the elite. They had no fancy gear, no famous last names, but they had something money can't buy, fire in their eyes. Samuel trained each one like they were his own grandchildren, with patience, with firmness, with the sparkle of someone who believes teaching is planting eternity. The first few months were challenging. There was subtle prejudice from some members. Some claimed the club was losing its essence, but there was also support. Veterans were moved seeing kids running on the greens. The cafeteria lady offered free snacks. A father who had never stepped foot in a golf club came personally to say thank you. The stories were intertwining, and where there was once division, belonging began to blossom. Local media discovered the project, and soon Samuel's story made headlines. News articles called him the man who became a symbol of inclusion in sports. Interviews, reports, tributes. But he remained the same. Simple, quiet, always deflecting attention. When asked how he felt, he responded with a phrase that would become famous. Those who act for vanity want echoes. I just want silence and transformation. And that was true. The sound of change didn't come from spotlights. It came from children's laughter, timid steps turning confident, and unsteady hands learning to aim with precision. Mornings at the club were never the same. Before, the fields only came alive after 9. Now by 7, there was already a line of little learners waiting for Samuel with their makeshift clubs. And he always arrived the same way, worn-out hat, water bottle, and that gaze that blends gentleness with resolve. Every practice was more than technique. It was a life lesson. Stories of resilience, discipline, and respect. Because on the course, he said, the grass is the same for everyone. What changes is how you walk on it. Then came the first tournament. The children participated as guests of honor. They played in pairs with veterans, learned the rules, laughed, made big mistakes, and were applauded for it. Because that day, golf wasn't about performance. It was about belonging. And Samuel, seated on a wooden bench, eyes glistening, knew that this was the greatest victory of his life. At the end of the event, a shy 9-year-old boy approached with a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing. Samuel appeared giant, holding a club surrounded by kids. At the top of the page, in crooked letters, it read, "The best coach in the world." Samuel knelt, hugged the boy, and said, "You don't know it, but this is the greatest trophy I've ever received." And in that simple scene lived the meaning of all the stories that had crossed paths at that club. In the following months, the project grew. Other cities wanted to replicate the idea. Clubs that once closed their doors began to open space for diversity. Samuel became a reference not because of his glorious past, but because of his humble present. And when he was invited to speak at a conference on sports and inclusion, he said something that echoed across social media for weeks. The problem was never age. It was the gaze of those who think they're too young to respect. And that's why this story matters. Because it's not just about a man who overcame prejudice. It's about a system that began to rethink itself. A club that let go of pride to embrace purpose. A society that, little by little, begins to understand that legacy isn't measured in trophies, but in the lives we transform. Samuel listened to the proposal in silence, with that calm look that cuts through appearances and goes straight to what matters. The club president spoke with excitement, trying to convince him to accept the honor. A room named after him, a golden plaque, maybe even a bust at the main field's entrance. "You're a legend. You deserve to be immortalized here," they said. But Samuel, with the serenity of someone who's lived too long to be impressed by glass cases, thanked them and took a deep breath. "I do want to help, but on one condition, that you offer scholarships to children who've never had access to golf." The phrase dropped into the room like a stone in still water. First, silence, then exchanged glances, and finally applause. Because right there, in front of those suited men, a 76-year-old man had just proven that true greatness isn't in static recognition, but in living transformation. He didn't want a legacy stuck on a wall. He wanted one that breathes, that turns into new stories, day after day, on dusty ground, under the sun, among makeshift clubs and unboxed dreams. The club agreed, and the change was immediate, not just in documents and meeting notes, but in hallways, in fields, in eyes. For the first time, kids from the neighborhood, the outskirts, even shelters, began to attend a place that once seemed from another world. No branded gear, no proper clothing, no clue how to even hold a club, but with a fire in their eyes that made any designer uniform look like nothing. Samuel welcomed each one with a wide smile and attentive eyes. He taught them how to aim, how to breathe, how to respect the wind, but he also taught what no golf manual ever does: patience with oneself, the silent listening of the heart, the strength of persistence. Each lesson offered more than technique. It offered philosophy, and it didn't take long for those kids to understand. The golf course was just the stage. The real swing was happening inside them. It was common to see a boy miss the hole 3, 4, 5 times, and Samuel didn't correct him with scolding. He would crouch down to the child's level and say, "You know what changes the game? It's not strength, it's focus." And then he'd start teaching again, with the same gentleness of someone who knows they're shaping more than just an athlete. They're shaping a human being. And so, day after day, new stories were born there. Stories of overcoming, discovery, and belonging. The older club members who once frowned at the little intruders began to observe, then to greet them, and without realizing it, they began to cheer for them. Some even asked to sit in on the lessons, watching from the benches near the course, like someone discovering a new passion. One of them, visibly moved, commented, "I never thought a kid without gloves or a uniform could teach me so much about humility." And it was true, because those boys and girls didn't know what an international tournament was, nor the weight of a famous name, but they knew what it was to be seen, to be valued by someone who truly cared. Samuel had become more than a teacher. He was a mentor, a counselor, a friend. Sometimes he arrived with a little bag of candy and gave one to each student as if it were a medal, and each sweet came with a short but powerful phrase, "Today you played with your heart," or, "You made a mistake with a smile, and that's beautiful." Simple words, but they echoed inside those children like hymns of self-worth. The most beautiful thing was that Samuel never sought the spotlight. He didn't raise his voice or give fiery speeches. He simply acted, and by acting with heart, he transformed every corner of that club into a more human space, more accessible, more real. The groundskeepers, once invisible, began to be called by name. The veteran players who used to walk past the kids began to shake hands, offer advice, share their own stories. And so, what started as a humble request turned into a silent revolution, a revolution made with worn-out clubs, donated balls, and love overflowing in every gesture. The club's own instructors asked to learn from Samuel's unique teaching style. They wanted to understand how he could teach with so few words and so much impact. And he replied with his usual simplicity, "I teach with memory. Every child here reminds me of who I was, and who I still can be." One afternoon, a reporter from a sports channel came to interview Samuel. She asked about awards, his career, and memorable victories. He responded politely but deflected the focus. He pointed to the children in the background, saying that they were his greatest achievements, that every smile, every fearless step, every child who came back the next day was an invisible trophy. And then, he looked at the camera and said, "If everything I went through helped open a door for them, then it was all worth it." And that was the phrase that went viral, that captured the nation, that made other clubs rethink their social projects. Samuel had unintentionally reprogrammed the future of golf. And more than that, he proved that true legacy isn't measured in trophies. It's measured in transformation, in the stories that multiply when someone dares to break the cycle of exclusion. Today, that club has a dedicated space for children. It has new teachers who traveled just to learn from the master of silence, as Samuel came to be known. It has kids' tournaments with adapted rules, community commentary, and symbolic trophies, like wooden figurines painted by the children themselves. And it has something even more important, respect. Not respect forced by medals or titles, but respect born from eye contact, from care, from commitment. Samuel still visits the club every week, not every day as age has slowed his pace, but he goes. And when he arrives, it's a celebration. Kids run to hug him, staff pause to greet him, and even the youngest listen to him with reverence. Because everyone there knows that slow-moving man changed the course of many lives, and he did it with kindness, with presence, with truth. At the end of the first year of the project, a small ceremony was held. No fanfare, no spotlights, just the children, their parents, the teachers, and Samuel sitting on the wooden bench where it all began. One of the students, eyes welling with tears, took the microphone and said, "Before I discovered golf, I thought I didn't belong anywhere. Now I know I can be wherever I want, because someone believed in me." Silence. And then, tears. Samuel stood up, took the microphone with steady hands and said, "The problem was never age. It's the gaze of those who think they're too young to show respect." Once again, silence. A silence that said everything, because within that phrase lived the essence of all the stories that had come together there. It was more than a lesson. It was a mirror, and that mirror now reflected something new, a more humane club, a fairer future, and a powerful truth. At the end of the new tournament, in front of promising youths, silent veterans, and the entire community gathered under a symbolic sunset, Samuel approached the microphone. His steps were slow but firm. The golf course, once a scene of scorn and doubt, was now filled with attentive eyes and open hearts. When he held the microphone, silence fell. It was as if everyone knew this would be unforgettable. With hands marked by time and a calm voice, he looked into each person's eyes, not to demand respect, but to offer it first. And then he said, with the wisdom of someone who has known neglect, "The problem was never age. It's the gaze of those who think they're too young to show respect." And in that exact second, the world paused. The wind stilled, phones were lowered, and even the most skeptical felt a lump in their throat. Because that sentence wasn't just a statement, it was a mirror, a reminder that many stories are lost to pride alone. There was no immediate applause. There was reflection. A reverent silence filled the space, containing decades of neglect, denied opportunities, talents ignored because of gray hair or wrinkles. Samuel's words cut across generations. They touched the young, full of plans, but empty of listening. They touched the veterans, who had long awaited recognition. And they touched everyone who, at some point in life, judged before understanding. When his speech ended, there was no loud music or fireworks, but something stronger happened. There were genuine hugs, handshakes with tears in the eyes, a teenage boy jotting down quotes in a notebook as if they were formulas for success, a veteran discreetly wiping his eyes, remembering when he too had been left aside, forgotten for not fitting the mold of usefulness. That moment became a memory, but not just any memory. It became one of those stories that cross generations because they carry truth. The emotion was so deep that even the event's sponsors, used to institutional speeches and selfies with medalists, fell silent. One said to another, "We came here for PR, and we left learning about humanity." And that's what it was. What happened at that club wasn't just a sports event. It was a reunion with what truly matters, the dignity of those who have a story to tell, even after the world has turned its back. Samuel didn't win a trophy that day, and maybe he didn't want one. What he gained was far greater. He gained the recognition that his life had been worth it, not just for the titles he won when he was young, but for the seeds he planted now, in old age. Because true impact isn't at the top of the podium, it's in the eyes of someone who learned something from you. And that day, many learned. Some learned humility, others how to listen, and some, finally, what respect truly means. It was one of those days when time seems to slow down just so we can feel everything more deeply. And the stories born there weren't written on paper. They were written in living memory. A boy told his grandfather, "When I grow up, I want to be like your friend Samuel." And the grandfather replied, "Then learn to listen first before you try to teach." The lesson had been given. The most remarkable thing is that it all began with scorn, with muffled laughter when Samuel showed up at the club weeks earlier, asking to play around. He was a 76-year-old man, wearing simple clothes, with a calm demeanor. Nothing about him drew attention, until he picked up the club and showed with elegance and precision that experience doesn't retire. From then on, he won over everyone, not with strength, but with presence. And that presence became legacy. In the days that followed, the club changed. Young people started listening more, elders began speaking more, and most importantly, everyone began respecting more. They created an intergenerational integration program, built a Veterans Stories wall. Even practice sessions now began with life-sharing before warm-ups, all because of one presence, one man, one phrase, one silence that taught more than any shout. And that's why, at its core, this isn't just Samuel's story. It's the story of everyone who's ever been underestimated, of all who've heard, "This isn't for you anymore," and kept going anyway, who proved that human worth has no expiration date, that being old isn't a weakness, it's an accumulation of knowledge, of failures, of comebacks. Samuel became a symbol, but not of loud resistance, a symbol of a silent revolution that begins with a look, passes through listening, and ends in a gesture of empathy. At the end of the event, as the spotlights dimmed and the final greetings wrapped up, a young athlete approached Samuel. She pulled a small bracelet from her pocket, one she'd worn since childhood. and handed it to him. She said, "This is my lucky charm. But today I realized that true luck is having someone like you around." Samuel smiled, placed the bracelet on his wrist, and replied, "Now it'll protect my memories." And that's how that chapter closed. Not with medals, but with humanity. Not with fiery speeches, but with truth. Because in the end what remains isn't fame or money or applause, and it's respect. Not the kind forced by rules or titles, but the kind born of genuine admiration. From the look that sees value in someone without needing labels. From the gesture that says, "I see you, and I learn from you." Have you ever truly stopped to think, with all the sincerity you have, how many times your eyes met someone else's and, in a fleeting moment you concluded, this person has no use anymore? Maybe at some point you believed they'd served their purpose, or that their value had run out. And how many fascinating stories and life lessons might you have missed, simply because the wrapping seemed outdated, worn, or lacking the youth you equated with vitality? Amid the rush and choices life imposes, maybe what we need isn't to reclaim youth, but to cultivate a deep humility capable of listening to those who've walked the road, who've known the mysteries and joys of life intensely, even if time has left its mark on their contours. When you reflect on what you could do differently from this moment forward, an inevitable question arises. Will you continue to evaluate and assign value to people solely based on numbers, records, or the labels imposed by society? Or are you willing to open your heart to truly listen, to understand the wealth that lies within the experiences of others, letting go of labels and allowing yourself to judge less? Because it is exactly this difference between those who pass by unnoticed and those who leave an unforgettable legacy that defines the impact each person leaves on the world. Think of Samuel, whose quiet but deeply meaningful existence touches the soul of those who truly observe. He proves that even the simplest gestures or stories told without fanfare hold a transformative power capable of reigniting hope and inspiring genuine change. If you felt even subtly that these words resonate within you, if this message stirred a new perspective about the importance of listening and embracing the narratives time has gently carved into each human being, then I invite you to take the next step. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Here, every video and every message goes beyond mere content. They are invitations to a new way of seeing the world, an opportunity to rethink hasty judgments and adopt an attitude where respect and attention outweigh superficial labels and societal conventions. Think about those moments when you met someone who, despite having faced many challenges, still held on to their sensitivity and ability to love. That person may have been underestimated by many, yet their gaze, their words, and even their silences carried messages of resilience, strength, and a gentle call for you to look beyond the surface. When you recognize that each wrinkle, each tired-looking gesture, is a testimony to a path walked with courage, you become part of a legacy that transcends time and shallow judgments. Now imagine a world where instead of labeling one another based on appearances or cold data, we chose to engage with empathy and genuine curiosity, a world where every encounter is seen as a unique opportunity to learn something new, to be inspired by stories that speak to our hopes as well as to the challenges of the human condition. In that world, those who dare to see beyond the outside reveal themselves not merely as spectators of their own lives, but as active participants in building a more conscious and compassionate future. If you're open to this reflection, if you understand that by listening more and judging less, you open yourself to a world of possibilities where each experience becomes another thread in the fabric of your own journey, then know that this thought has already begun transforming the way you relate to others. After all, it's not numbers or imposed designations that define the worth of a life, but rather the ability to embrace, to respect, and to celebrate each path, no matter how different or difficult it may appear. So the choice ahead is clear: to keep acting based on imposed labels, or to consciously and courageously explore the beauty that lives within the diversity of human stories. Here, each message is an invitation to see both yourself and others through a new lens, an invitation to sharpen your gaze, open your heart, and expand your mind to the nuances of a fulfilled existence. If this reflection moved your spirit, share this message, subscribe, and stay close to every new narrative. Each lesson that brings us closer to a world where empathy and awareness reign supreme. Let this be the starting point of a journey where respect is built through listening and legacy is grounded in the honoring of every story, no matter how old it may seem. And may we, when looking at each other, be moved by a genuine desire to discover what is most authentic within every being. Transformation begins the moment we abandon judgment and start cultivating understanding, paving the way to a future where people are seen not by their appearance, but by the depth of their story. Only then can we truly celebrate the richness of a life lived in its fullness, where every experience, every silence, and every word form the unique symphony that is life. You've now been challenged to rethink your perceptions and transcend the limits of immediate judgment. Remember, true change begins when we choose to listen with an open heart, honoring each story shared and each experience accumulated over time. May this message inspire you to build bridges where there were once barriers, and to cherish the wisdom each human being carries within. In a world longing for more understanding and less division, your attentive gaze and welcoming attitude can make all the difference. Because when we stop measuring people's worth by numbers and labels, we make room for the beauty and complexity of life to emerge in its most authentic and inspiring form. With every step you take in that direction, you're contributing to the construction of a legacy that transcends the fleeting, transforming every encounter into a chance for mutual growth and renewed meaning. Let empathy and respect be your compass, and may each story, no matter how unique, become a beacon of light, guiding the way for others who, like you, have chosen to embrace the beauty of human diversity. This is your chance to change the way the world connects. May every word here encourage you to cultivate a new attitude, one where active listening and sincere recognition become the pillars of richer and truer relationships. The future is built through dialogue and through the ability to be moved by someone else's story. Walk with courage and openness and let your inner transformation radiate across every path you take. And when this reflection ends, may you feel inspired to break down prejudice and celebrate the diversity of experience and wisdom that each life holds. May the legacy you help build be marked not by judgment, but by understanding and unconditional love for the richness of being human. You now hold in your hands the opportunity to help transform the world through the simple, yet powerful act of listening. It is within that openness to others that the greatest achievements and most profound transformations reside. Let every new experience, every new conversation, be a step toward a world where respect and empathy become the shared language of all human connection. May this invitation echo in every heart, and may we, together, build a legacy of humanity, where every story is honored, and every life is celebrated in its entirety.